Good afternoon to everybody in Amman, and good morning to our colleagues and honored speakers from the US. Uh, this is a technical committee, but we've opened it up to broader members of the food producing companies, which we hope will be able to join us. We're undertaking a very important activity today to try to understand the technical requirements to export to the US market. And this is part of a bigger initiative to introduce better measures for food safety in Jordan, focusing on the traceability element, and of course, opening up the US market to Jordanian products and supporting deeper economic ties. I want to take a moment to thank all the members of the technical committee who have dedicated so much time and effort to this. And I also would like to thank USAID MEG project who are supporting this activity and our distinguished and honored Bob and Susan, experts who are gonna explain to us today. So thank you very much. Also, I want to acknowledge Olaf, who's the EU expert, and this is part of a national work that we're doing with the IFC. I know Sergey, all of you know Sergey, couldn't make it today, but we're working on pieces, and hopefully we can move one step at a time and work together towards introducing better food safety in Jordan and growing our exports to the US. So thank you all. And I don't know if somebody would like to say something. I would just housekeeping. Please keep your mics off if you're not speaking. If you want to speak, please raise your hand, or you try. If you some facing technical challenges, you can also. This is an open meeting, so you can also speak. But be mindful of not interrupting anybody. So without further ado, I want to ask anybody if they want to say something before we move to the expert, to Bob, of course.
I think in the name of Pragma and USAID, I would like to welcome everybody on board. We have been working very hard and smart with the AmCham team, with Lana on several components. This traceability component is very important for the export activities of Jordan to the US. Bob and his team have done an excellent job helping AmCham understand the rules and regulations. So we are looking forward to this presentation, and welcome again, everyone.
Thank you, Henry, for always supporting us. For those of you who don't know Henry, Henry is our U.S. Support, and we're grateful, of course, to USAID for their continued support to Jordan and AmCham. So without any delay, please, Bob, the floor is yours, and we can start the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lana. Can everyone hear me okay?
Okay.
Good. Well, thank you for everyone's time and attention, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this interesting and important project. As the title slide here indicates, what we're going to talk about today involves the export to the U.S. of foods other than meat and poultry. We do have, as many we do have another session scheduled tomorrow that will attach to those products, which, as we'll discuss tomorrow, function under a different system that's overseen by the United States Department of Agriculture. But this would be applicable essentially to all other foods that are potentially to be imported into the United States. And with that, next slide, Susan. Okay, let's start with the basics. Let's start with the laws, the statutes that drive these requirements. And the first one listed is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. which has been in effect in this country for over a century. And as the name implies, it attaches to not just to food products, but to pharmaceuticals, cosmetics. It also is applicable to medical devices. So it covers a very wide range of consumer products under this statute. And the core concepts that are addressed in the statute, the core requirements and the core elements it involves, the two important words are adulteration and misbranding. That with adulteration, that food moving in the United States commerce has to be suitable for human consumption. And misbranding means it can't be misrepresented, that people need to know what they're getting. And if you think about those two concepts as kind of the trunk of a tree, everything else we're talking about are really extensions of that or branches of that in ways in which those two concerns are addressed. Again, to make sure that in this case food, that products moving in commerce are not adulterated, are not misbranded, and are suitable for human consumption. That, as I say, that law goes back over a century. But the most significant amendment to that law, the second item listed, what's termed the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was enacted by our Congress about a decade ago. It intensifies and modifies the way in which foods, both imported and domestically produced, are regulated in the United States. And the core concept here is that we'll get into further on in the discussion is the notion of preventive food safety. To oversimplify a bit, prior to enactment of the Food Safety Modernization Act and relevant regulations, it was really up to the government to prove that something was wrong with the product, to prove that it was adulterated or misbranded. But what the Food Safety Modernization Act does in a significant way is essentially shift that responsibility and shift that burden of proof, such that if you're marketing food in the United States, again, either foreign or domestic, that it is up to you to be able to affirmatively document that the food is safe. And depending upon the food, depending upon how the food is handled, that can lead to a wide variety of concerns and elements that you have to deal with. But the core concept is that if you're marketing food within the United States or coming into the United States.
بابا.
Yes, sir.
شو اسمه بتقدر تميل علي؟ اي ساعة بتخلص؟
excuse me.
اي وقت تيجي هسه اهلا وسهلا.
We okay?
Yeah, just the mic is on. Sorry.
Oh, okay, fine. Again, the concept is that you have to be in a position to document that you have that you've identified potential risks in the food that you're marketing, and that you've put controls in place to make sure that that food is safe. And if you're unable to do that, you're subject to a wide variety of sanctions, including just not being able to sell the food. The third building block here is the so-called Bioterrorism Act. And that was enacted almost 20 years ago. It was enacted by our Congress in the wake of the attacks in the United States on the day generally referred to as 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, which raised the parallel concern of not so much food safety, but food security. In other words, the notion that the food supply was a potential point of vulnerability to terrorists or other kinds of attacks, and that they therefore needed additional controls to make sure that we knew where the food was coming from, and in the event of addition of activity of that type, it could more easily be tracked and identified. So again, the concept there that advances sort of in tandem with food safety is food security, that we need to make sure, and this goes among other things to the concept of traceability, we need to make sure we understand where the food is coming from, where it's been stored, where there are vulnerabilities that could put the American public at risk. So those are the basic statutory building blocks we're working from. And in the context of food security, the core requirement that's advanced by the Bioterrorism Act is food facility registration, so that again, all food handling facilities, and note in the slide it says any activity. So this is not just a processor. This would attach to, a distributor, a warehouse, anyone who is basically in the food supply chain that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds food for human or animal consumption must be registered with the FDA before it can do anything else. And the required information that's listed here is you need to identify the food categories, the activities, and its unique identifier through what's called the DUNS number you may be familiar with, but that's a privately based registration system in this country where you get a unique, I believe it's 9-digit code that identifies your facility. And so that's a prerequisite to any type of food handling in this space. And after that registration takes place, it'll be verified by via the DUNS number and the U.S. agent. And that's the basic registration process for the facility, as distinct from any food shipment itself. That's step one. Is any such facility is going to need to be registered through this process to achieve compliance with the Bioterrorism Act. Okay. The related on the food safety side, the core requirement is foreign supplier verification. And what that entails is that gets to the heart of, I think, the compliance issue that I've talked about, is this notion that in accordance with the Food Safety Modernization Act, food marketers, again, both foreign and domestic, need to be able to affirmatively demonstrate food safety. The additional, the question that attaches in the import area is what's the mechanism, and the point of contact there in this system is the importer. There was some controversy as this developed as to how do you identify who the importer is. It's generally the registered agent, but it's more broadly defined as the entity that is responsible for bringing the goods into the United States. And yeah, that's where affirmative safety has to be demonstrated and documented. Again, with those two magic words I talked about, that the food is not adulterated, it's suitable for consumption, and it's not misbranded. It's not being represented as something that it is not. That gets us to this core concept of preventive food safety. The analysis, which is the phrase that's used by FDA, which is a spinoff from hazard analysis critical control points that you may be familiar with. It's called HARP-C because it has a somewhat broader net, but it's really the same concept, that there needs to be a step-by-step process whereby, number one, the food handler has to determine known or reasonable foreseeable hazards with each food, evaluate the risks that are posed, and then put preventive controls in place that document that those potential risks have been effectively addressed, and that systems are in place to conduct verification of those activities, and the corrective actions are taken when something goes wrong. So it's consistent with the broader concepts of quality control. The notion, this goes back historically, this whole concept in the United States goes back several decades to the United States Space Program. When the United States first started thinking about putting astronauts in outer space in the late 1950s, early 1960s, astronauts had to be fed. And there was a contract, I believe, with the Pillsbury Corporation. So the people at the Pillsbury Corporation are sitting there thinking, if something goes wrong, if our food makes an astronaut sick in outer space, we've got a big problem. We've probably risked our company. How are we going to deal with that? And the first one thought was, well, okay, we can test everything, but if you start submitting food to a battery of tests, you wind up with prohibitive expense. So the quality control concepts, which are similar to manufacturing concepts pioneered by people like Edward Deming, is if you control the process properly, your output will be okay. So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, let's look at the process. Let's look at what can go wrong. Let's control it. Let's measure it. Let's document it. Let's continue to refine the process in some continuous improvement mode. And that's the concept that's been adopted here across the board in the food safety system. And again, if we go back to foreign supplier verification, what the importer of record is responsible for is saying that the food in question that's being presented for entry into the United States complies with that regime and that concept, and that if I'm the importer, I've got documentation on hand to demonstrate that all of those potential issues have been addressed. Good. Okay. So again, just to go into this in a bit more detail, once you do the hazard analysis, if the hazard is present, a control is required. And the general risk categories are biological, chemical, and potential physical hazards. Biological, which we'll get into a bit. There's been, as you're probably aware, there's been increasing concern in this country and worldwide about potential microbiological contamination of food through pathogens such as Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, that sort of thing. Chemical hazards such as chemical residues, and physical hazards such as foreign material contamination, that sort of thing. If the hazard is present, you need to, step one is there a possibility that could occur? Step two is, if it can occur, what control have you put in place to make sure that it's properly controlled? And that gets into all of these factors, such as the formulation, the design of the establishment, the equipment you're using, the raw materials, transportation, harvesting, a very wide range of potential risk factors that the system is asking you to consider, and if they are relevant to your product and your process, to put a control in place to make sure that that potential hazard has been addressed. The the verification involves written procedures, and I'll probably say this again, but um, as a broader article of faith here, the notion is if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So it's all well and good to have an effective system in place, but if you're not in a position to wind up at the point of entry being able to document the existence and the effective performance of that system, then you're going to have a problem. So the program must be applied for every food imported into the U.S. On that basis. Go ahead, Susan. Okay, this is again, this is an elaboration on preventive controls, and it goes beyond the first element of hazard analysis and controls as required by FVSP. It attaches to other issues. A major one that's listed here is food allergens. That, as you probably again are aware, has become an increasing public concern. That's one of the largest categories that has triggered recalls in recent years in United States commerce. A lot of times that can be a function of simply a failure to identify a potential food allergen on the labeling of a product. It could involve potential cross-contamination of product with known allergens such as nuts, shellfish, those kinds of things. So if you have a food product with a potential allergen, your preventive controls have to extend to uncover the allergen risk as well. There's also a sanitation element to preventive controls. Sanitation is, in a certain sense, a freestanding concept, but it leads back to adulteration in the sense that what's embedded in the U.S. law is that food is considered to be adulterated if it's been packed, processed, or held under insanitary conditions. So what that would mean as a practical matter is you could have food products in storage that have been subject to all these preventive controls. There's no reason to believe there's anything wrong with the food itself, but if it's sitting there in an insanitary environment, that gives the regulator the authority without having to demonstrate there's anything wrong with the food itself. The failure to maintain proper sanitation can cause the regulator to classify that food as adulterated, and as such ineligible for United States commerce. So again, that management control includes this notion of monitoring, correcting corrective actions, and verifying that corrective actions have taken place. And that includes, and that gets us into this concept that we've talked about, and we'll talk about some more. The concept of traceability here is that you need a supply chain program that can address that risk. The other thing that is required under this system is a recall plan. Okay, if something goes wrong, whether it's your fault or not, you need to have a plan in place if the regulators conclude that there is, a potential risk for product that you already have entered into commerce. You have to have a system in place to get proper notification to your consignees and possibly to the public as a whole to identify that food as potentially unsafe and subject to recall. Recalls again have taken on increasing importance in the U.S. system, and they can be, they can have significant impact. They are largely, as a technical matter, they are largely considered voluntary, although in the Food Safety Modernization Act, for the first time, FDA has mandatory recall authority, but that is almost never used because what happens in a recall situation or a potential recall situation is either the company itself identifies the problem, notifies the regulators and takes corrective action, which in this case would be announcing a recall, or a problem is identified by the regulators, such as the detection of a microbiological contaminant, and the regulator contacts the relevant food company, food handler, and requests a voluntary recall. But in those circumstances, you're really not in a position to say no, because the regulator has the data it believes is indicative of a public health threat. There's the notion that this is an urgent situation. The regulator has the opportunity to seize the product if you don't cooperate. And as a practical matter, the negative publicity that could attach to refusing a recall is not something that any company wants to put up with. So recalls in this country are technically voluntary, but they're voluntary in a situation where you really don't have much choice in the matter if the regulators are convinced that there's food out there on the shelf the consumer is exposed to that present an unacceptable level of risk. All right, let's get to traceability. This is this I know is an important element of your concerns here. Let's start, if we start with the basics, the current, and this is the current rule, under the, and this goes back to the Bioterrorism Act, it's a pretty simple requirement of what's termed one step forward and one step back. In other words, in basic terms, foreign or domestic, you're required to be able to identify where your last link in the chain, where you got the food, and your forward link, where it's headed. And if you've done that, you've complied with the basics to basics of traceability as is currently required in the United States. However, there is a rule pending as published by the FDA in September of 2020 to establish additional requirements for what are termed high-risk foods. Now, what that means, it's worth talking about what that means. What we have in the United States is a process called notice and comment rulemaking, where the agency, in this case.
Can you repeat that? I didn't catch it. What is it?
I'm sorry, it's called notice and comment rulemaking. So if the regulator, in this case the FDA, believes it has the authority to establish a new rule, absent an emergency, it can't simply just announce a new rule. What it has to do is write up and publish in a document in something called the Federal Register, which is sort of an official government registry. It publishes a proposal. It says, this is a rule that we want to establish. And here's the rule we want to establish. Here's why we want to establish it. Here's our rationale. Here's what we think are the potential impacts. But before we finalize that rule, we will entertain public comment uh, that, you know, people can agree with it, they can disagree with it, they can make technical criticisms, they can suggest modifications. There's an open public written process. A lot of that, like everything else these days, is handled online, but comments can be submitted. Then it is the agency's obligation to evaluate all those comments, take them into account before it publishes a final rule. Once it publishes a final rule, usually there's an additional deadline of 60 or 90 or some days. That rule then goes into effect. And in evaluating that final rule, um, the comment process, it's not an election. It's not a question of how many people agree or disagree. It's a question of whether, to what degree, there are comments to the rule that persuade the regulator, in this case FDA, it should do something different. But if it's not persuaded to do something different, it can simply follow, it can simply take the rule as proposed and finalize it. And at that point, and this is often a long, slow, this is generally a long, slow process that tends to drag on for a couple of years, that becomes the rule. So what we have now pending is a proposed rule that would require additional documentation for what they term high-risk foods, and we'll get into in a second what those are. But the notion is, if you have a high risk of food, that one step forward, one step back system is not going to be considered good enough. You need to identify, uh, key elements, things that could otherwise go wrong in the food chain, key element, and critical tracking events to keep an eye on those problems and see what goes wrong. It's really, it's an elaboration in some respects of this notion of preventive controls, that for certain products, you need additional traceability records that will be required. Let's go back to the next slide, Susan. Go up to the next slide. Here's the food. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Go forward, Susan. Yeah. Here's the list. And you can see, I know there's, in the dairy area, you can see cheeses is, other than the hard cheeses, is one of the first. The common characteristic of all these foods, you see shell eggs, nut butter, various fresh produce. I mean, the unifying concept here for these products is the potential risk, because the absence of a of a logical kill step. If you focus, for example, on fresh fruits and vegetables, there's there's really there's nothing, there's no sort of food safety treatment that's been applied, say, to the tomato once it's picked all the way to the consumer's table. So in that instance, that's where additional traceability needs to go into effect, possibly all the way back to the farm, to make sure that nothing has gone wrong. So that's where for these higher, what are really considered higher risk foods, again, one step forward, one step back is not good enough. You need a more elaborate traceability system. Again, if you go back to cheeses on the front, other than hard cheese, the notion is that there are additional risks that would attach, and we need to go further into the cheese making process to make sure if something goes wrong that we can trace back to the source. again, the unifying concept here is that when something goes wrong, we need to zero in on the source of the hazard so it can be identified and that the problem can be corrected. I mean, there have been major issues in the United States. For example, again, I mentioned tomatoes. There were, those are obviously ubiquitous in the diet. There are lots of tomatoes moving around, either for direct consumption or used in food processing. And if you identify, say, some sort of contamination outbreak, it can become incredibly difficult if tomatoes are suspected to figure out where the tomatoes of concern come from. So that goes to the underlying logic behind this broader pending traceability requirement. So once again, this is not currently an element of US law, but for these products, it is certainly headed in that direction. So, okay. Back to import, in addition to, I talked earlier, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lana.
But can you repeat what you talked about, the direction of the US and how that means that their requirements, what are the requirements now vis-a-vis? Can you just clarify a bit more on that?
Sure. Again, the requirement.
I hope, I'm sorry to disturb, but I really want to understand.
No, that's fine. I'm fine with these kinds of clarifying questions. I mean, that's perfectly all right. Again, this is in terms of process. In terms of the current requirement, the only legally binding requirement is this one step forward, one step back. However, FDA is on record saying this is what we intend to require in the future. And as a practical matter, I think I mentioned this in the paper and elsewhere, there's nothing to stop and everything to suggest it would be a good idea for these practices to be voluntarily adopted now. The theoretical risk, in other words, I would think for these products, it would make basic sense, even though it's not now a binding legal requirement for these types of practices to be voluntarily adopted by marketers of these high-risk foods. There's nothing to stop you from doing it now. There is a theoretical risk that FDA could modify the final rule in a way that would cause you to modify what you're doing. But number one, that's unlikely. And number two, it makes sense, I think, for a variety of reasons, to be ahead of the curve here. This is going to happen sooner rather than later. The fact that you're doing it now is a positive indicator of the seriousness of your control mechanisms, of your knowledge of both what's on the books and what is coming. So I guess my practical, as I put my lawyer hat on, I would say, you're not required to do this. If I put a practical hat on, I would say it makes infinite sense to start doing this now. Does that make sense, Lana?
Yeah, but I don't know if it's so we don't have misunderstanding. If you want to highlight, just touch upon it, and because I know we're going to discuss it tomorrow, because there's always this lingering question. If I have as the factory level, the facility level, this one step forward, one step back, I don't know if we just want to highlight it and say that we can address this question tomorrow for the companies as well, given the fact that I can't export now to the US, the way the situation stands currently in Jordan. So if we just flag that for everybody, so we don't have a misunderstanding, so we're clear on the processes in theory at least. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, now we talked earlier about foreign supplier verification, but what is related to that but somewhat independent is this notion of um, prior notice. In other words, what you're also required to do in accordance with the Bioterrorism Act is to let FDA know that the food is on the way. And that's a pretty simple, straightforward notification process. Where so there's a link here that's the prior notice page, but that simply requires basic information to be conveyed to FDA that the shipment in question is headed toward the United States. That that doesn't change the fact that when it gets here, foreign supplier verification needs to take place, but the foreign supplier verification absent the prior notice isn't going to be good enough. In other words, you can show up at the port of entry with everything perfectly in order with all of your foreign supplier verification materials, but you're going to have a problem if you have not satisfied the notice requirement as well. So again, that's not particularly a burdensome requirement, but it's something that needs to be done on a routine basis whenever these shipments are taking place. And presumably some of your companies that are shipping product to the United States now are doing that currently. Go ahead, Susan. Okay. So we get to the point of entry. Oops. Something went wrong. Okay. Okay. So you get to the port of entry, and here's where in effect an inspection, potential inspection takes place. Here you've got an interplay between FDA and U.S. Customs as well, because like all goods, not just food, are subject to customs inspection as well. So at the port of entry, you've got two authorities to deal with, FDA potentially and customs. And you have, and we'll talk a bit more about, tariff schedules and how they attach, because the entries will identify where that process might fit within tariff schedules, and then all of the supplier elements that we talked about, the documentation, the bills of lading, the purchase orders, so on and so on. And this can be done through customs brokers. And when we talk about customs, that's where we get into other areas that are worth mentioning. Again, we've talked about cheese and other dairy products. And while some of this is outside the scope of this discussion of my expertise, as you're probably aware, dairy products generally worldwide tend to be a protected category, and there are tariffs that attach, sometimes with prohibitive expense to some dairy imports. There are also licensing requirements that attach, to and permits, again, that are not food safety related, that are quota related, that can attach to certain cheeses. Those are independent customs requirements that are outside the scope of FDA, but could attach to the import of these products. So There are customs elements to this, tariff and economic elements to this, and they are within the context of the fact that the United States, like a lot of other countries, tends to be highly protective of its dairy industry, and tends to put, in addition to food safety requirements, tends to erect economic barriers to products that might compete with domestic dairy interests. Next item. So here are some additional programs of interest. The FDA does have a foreign food facility inspection program where it's not as extensive as the USDA program we'll get into tomorrow, but FDA does have the authority and exercises that authority to conduct inspections of foreign facilities. And there are accredited third-party programs where and this is important, accreditation bodies that FDA will rely upon that will essentially, they will essentially offload a lot of that certification requirement. There is a voluntary qualified importer program for importers for foods. That's a fee-based program that will essentially expedite shipments based upon your track record. And as it indicates, that requires a 3-year successful track record. But there are ways, once you've established yourself as a good actor in this market, there are ways, on a fee-based basis for this process to be simplified, to say, okay, we have positive experience collectively with Jordanian importers. They can qualify for expedited review of this. And as I said before, there are additional customs elements here that you need to take into account. Next time, okay. Here, just to wrap up my part of this, I mean, here are, I think, some of the practical considerations I've touched upon, but I would, emphasize again. Again, the core concept that goes to whether you call it HACCP, HARP-C, process control, is preventive food safety. The notion that I talked about earlier is advanced by the Food Safety Modernization Act, that it's not good enough to simply say, here's the food. There's no reason to think there's anything wrong with it. You have to go the next step and say, here's the food, and here's what shows and demonstrates and documents that there's nothing wrong with it. And again, documentation is essential. The phrase I said before, I'll repeat, is if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. I think you're a long way down that road. If you're in compliance with international norms about public and private, whether that's international standard setting by people like Codex, whether that's ISO 9000, those types of entities that are geared towards this system, your compliance with those will get you a long way towards compliance with the specific concrete regulatory requirements. And in broader terms, there's this notion that FDA in particular has increasingly emphasized, but I think it's difficult to quantify, but it's there, is the ability to demonstrate food safety culture. What does that mean? I think it means lots of different things to lots of different people, but part of that in sort of a cosmetic way is your familiarity with these concepts and really with the jargon and the words. But more fundamentally, it's a question of what's embedded in your company. One of the simpler and more basic yardsticks of that is the notion of how much independent authority does, say, your food safety and quality control team have? Are they in a position to overrule, let's just say hypothetically, whether you have a shipment pending, you have an important customer that's waiting for the food, whether it's foreign or domestic. You're trying to satisfy that customer, you're trying to meet that sales target, but the quality control people are saying, wait a minute, we have a concern here. We need to hold up this shipment. We need to run an additional test, so on and so on. Who wins that argument? Is it the operations and sales people who say, we're sorry, but the customer matters and we've got to satisfy him, versus the food safety person who's saying, no, there's too much of a risk? That's one sort of concrete example of food safety culture. But I think, again, FDA has talked about trying to work in the direction of somehow quantifying and requiring that. I think it's probably too elusive a concept for that to take place. But again, that's the kind of thing that the regulator is looking for. And the more you can project that, either on a company basis or on a collective basis, through the chamber and other things, your knowledge, your familiarity with, your commitment to having an effective food safety culture, the easier some of these particular elements are going to fall into place. With that, I think we've got time for some additional questions or discussion. Lana, if you want to open that up to the group.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I know I share everybody's feelings and appreciation for this wonderful presentation and explanation. We did supply you with some draft technical explanations that everybody already should have received in their inboxes. And for you to read also with this presentation, and if you have, so we're going to open now the floor for questions. And I think Sundus had a question. If you want, you can start. So please raise your hand, or just jump right in with respecting other people's turns, of course. So the floor is open and we're taking questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this good presentation, sir. My question was about what is considered the minimum frequency to perform a lab analysis to prove that a food is a free hazard or hazard-free or allergen-free? Is there anything that is regulated and considered as a minimum frequency for this type of analysis, but particularly? Thank you.
I think the short answer is no. The underlying concept is testing. Again, we're back to process control, and the notion is that the phrase that's used is you can't test your way to food safety. What testing functions as is a verification activity. In other words, the underlying notion is that that food safety is achieved by conformity with the control process. I mean, if we take a simple example such as proper cooking, let's say for a given product, you achieve, lethality at an internal temperature of 160 degrees. So what needs to be verified and documented is, in fact, that the food has been cooked to reach that temperature. What testing then does is verify that, is a cross check. Okay, if we were to test and find microbiological contamination, there's two possibilities. Either the product wasn't properly cooked, or that temperature is not sufficient to achieve lethality. But so what that leaves open-ended the question of how often you test. It becomes a question of whether you can document that the process itself is working and that the testing serves to verify that activity. But again, the very short answer to your question is there are no standards. Again, I think what the common thread, I think, in the FDA approach to this is this notion of one size doesn't fit all. And not only that, but we, the regulator, are not going to be the ones to tell you what the proper process, what the proper testing regimen is. That's your responsibility. And that's, to be a little bit cynical, what adoption of these processes have done is not just shift the burden of proof here to the industry, but to shift the burden of accountability. In other words, it's now easier for the regulator when something goes wrong to say, don't blame me, the regulator, blame the company that failed to establish an effective control process. But we, the regulator, are not going to tell them what that is, whether it's how often to test. It's going to be up to him to figure out what's an effective testing system.
Question to give details on prior notice. It's from Mr. Nu'man. Would you like to take the question, or Mr. Nu'man, or we're okay with reading the question? I think, Bob, can you please answer? Can you give more detail on prior notice, please?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly simple process where I think we have the link, but basically it's simply a question, it doesn't in and of itself address any of these other regulatory concerns. It is simply a question of going on record and letting the regulator, in this case FDA, know that the intention is to present food for admission into the United States, at customs at a given place at a given time. It's no different than my saying, Lana, I'm letting you know that I'm going to come visit your home next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Now, hopefully, you're going to be there and you're going to be happy to see me, but that's up to you. All I've done is told you of my intention, and everything else has to fall into place from there.
Thank you. I don't know if Mr. Nu'man wants to elaborate, but there's two differences. There's a prior notice that I'm shipping the product. This is for food product.
Yes.
Prior notice that comes from the USFDA saying that I'm gonna come and inspect your product, your facility. There's more than one prior notice. Maybe that's
right. Again, I think right. FDA will generally notify, and again, FDA inspection of foreign facilities is relatively rare, simply for resource reasons. They just don't have the resources to be absent special circumstances. They don't have the resources to be sending inspectors around the world on a routine basis. But under those circumstances, there can be FDA inspections of foreign facilities. As a general rule, there will be prior notice provided to the establishment, although there could be extraordinary emergency situations when there might be an unannounced visit, but that would be extremely rare.
Actually, we do have, last year we had a visit from the FDA food inspector. So we do have this happening. I don't know, Mr. Nu'man, is this okay for you as an answer? I think so. Should we move to Fadwa, for the floor, please? The floor is yours, Fadwa. Thank you.
Thank you for the well-organized presentations. It's much appreciated. Really, you covered every single step for the companies. In fact, my question might be discussed tomorrow.
Fadwa is one of your fans, Bob. So we would and we should. You are always welcome, and we're going to give you some great Arabic food if you come. And sorry, Fadwa.
Just come to Jordan and we'll present for you excellent recipes, Arabic food. And I'm pretty sure that you will like it. Actually, my question might be discussed tomorrow, but because you started with the responsibilities of the establishment and the companies to do with the FDA, starting from registering the food establishment. You know that Jordan is not listed as eligible country to as export to US. So can companies start with registration their establishments right now before listing Jordan as eligible country to for exporting to US, or do you think it's not worth it?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard all that, Lana. Can you help me understand the question a little better?
I think what maybe if I understood Fadwa, and you can please clarify. I think maybe we need you to help us, and maybe this we can ask this question tomorrow. But how, as a private sector, how can we reflect the importance of introducing the food traceability to our government? And I should acknowledge here that we have with us Mr. Bassam Arabiyat from the Ministry of Planning, our colleague, and we've been reaching out to government to create momentum around this important issue. But if I understood correctly, if you were the private sector, how would you reflect to the government the importance of having a traceability system? And maybe your thoughts on this. Is that right, Fadwa? Did I understand correctly your question? You can also answer it tomorrow, I guess.
Let me elaborate more. As a fact, Jordan is not listed as eligible country for exporting to US, okay? But the private sector and the companies can initiate registration their establishments with FDA. Okay, so could companies start registration their facilities before listing Jordan as eligible country for exporting to US?
Well, I think, well, if I understand correctly, there's a couple of elements to this. First of all, and we had these discussions before about potential traceability laws. To be clear, there's nothing, while the traceability requirements I've discussed, whether it's in, the 1 step forward, 2 step back, the pending rule that will go further, there's nothing to stop Jordan itself from establishing its own traceability requirements. And if those, if there happens to be a Jordanian law, if that happens to be more stringent than the US requires, there's nothing wrong with that. That could well enhance your ability. In other words, if you're 1 step ahead of where the US is going, that's fine. Because so you're able, I think on both levels, and on individual company level, you're certainly free to adopt, the most, whatever stringent traceability requirements you think would be most effective. And on a national level, you're free to adopt requirements which could be more stringent than those that are currently required by the United States. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. And in fact, that might be helpful to the overall cause of demonstrating a food safety culture and a desire to go the extra mile in terms of complying with US requirements.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any other questions from the floor, please? Okay. So I think you could wrap up now, Bob, and if you like, and we can. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to convene again tomorrow to discuss the U.S. Department of Agriculture requirements, which is something more challenging for us. I know that many companies do export food products and are familiar with the USFDA requirements, but we focus today on the traceability element, which is a missing component for us, and we're trying to introduce together. So I'll hand back the floor to Bob, and I want to thank Susan on everybody's behalf who's been working with us to help us out, and USAID, Meg, of course, and all the committee members. And thank you, Bob. So the floor is yours if you want to wrap up and close. Thank you.
No, I'd like to thank everybody for their time and attention. I hope this has been helpful. And, you know, I wish you all the best of luck moving forward and gaining access to this market. I hope this has been helpful toward that end. So I guess we'll see some of you tomorrow, but thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.